Hello everyone, today we talk about Polish, Lithuanian and Cossack warfare from the 15th to the 16th century. This is not a new topic, telling the truth, because back in the day I used to make several videos, especially about Polish-Lithuanian warfare. We did talk about the Cossacks in it. This is for the current mini-series at the end of the day of Eurasian steppes warfare. But it's important, as I said, also in the other intros to refresh sometimes here and there some concepts, some even some etymologies. For example, I don't know, the Hussars were such military styles came from how they mixed with, they grafted into other military cultures and so on, and why. Right, that's the most important thing for that matter. I give you normally all the links now, fixing the comment above all the others as far as related topics are concerned. But as you know, there is also probably the playlists that you can check out, all for free, because on Schwerpunkt that's how you really can access that large amount of stuff. And I ask you to share all this kind of stuff, but bear in mind that this channel is not designed for being merely accessed like every video, right? I made almost 1,800 of them, and I, at least also as far as other channels are concerned, at least use the courtesy of looking at more or less everything, or at least making a simple search through the actual function that you have on every channel on any given topic. Before saying something I already discussed, right? This is valid also for the requests, etc. Very often you ask me, and I'm glad of that, why can't you talk about this or that? I already did, a lot sometimes, about certain topics. Usually, of course, I will keep talking about them at some other point. And here we are with this quite important part of steppes warfare, right? Talking about Poland and Lithuania definitely is not about the steppes per se, but what would be known eventually as Lesser Poland, the area of Ukraine, and further in the so-called wild lands, definitely comes close to and properly into the steppes world. In a time in history that witnesses a bit the crisis of the steppes, its modernization to a degree, or at least when we look at this favorable corner in the westernmost part of the same, we realize that, of course, pike and shot tactics were significantly crippling traditional nomadic warfare. But we also observed the graduality of this process, right? In the 14th, let's say in the 15th to 16th century, a lot of things had yet to change, especially in Eastern Europe, where really the political and social system was more backwards than the rest of the continent, and where the steppes were still alive, right? If anything, even just in lifestyle, combat techniques, to the point that many of the Rus especially turned from sedentaries sometimes to, if not a nomadic lifestyle, however, a sort of bandit kind of one, to the point in this great frontier, the so-called wild plains, to the point of threatening from there, both say, or at least playing quite shrewdly and bloodily with or against these other sedentary powers in the north, and or even taking on the same nomads in the south, in the east, right? So a very interesting hybrid that mostly is embodied by the Cossacks. But as we've seen in the videos about the Polish-Lithuanian army, that had to do with probably a doctrinal modification of even some of the largest militaries out there. Poland especially had, by the end of the Middle Ages, fully westernized along the pattern of what is called Western in the narrower sense, let's say essentially in a Frankish way. Its armies were practically identical to the German ones. It's just the political and social background was slightly different, as we will see. In fact, this influence had in part been due to the of course to the updates and even the imports, right, that the Poles had to carry out for developing their armies. But with the establishment of the Commonwealth, so we're actually at the very end of this video's period, the Polish army fundamentally had, together with the Lithuanians, a much greater eastern frontier to cope with. The Polish army thus was re-easternized to some degree. The so-called winged hussars are a bit the most representative type of this kind of warfare, which is not much steppes-like, but surely is an anachronism. Albeit of success, as you know, these knights fundamentally would remain literally on horseback for quite a long time in the 17th century. In some desperate situation, it could even successfully take on frontally properly the Swedish pikemen, for example, also because their lances, but not just because their lances were longer, even in fact, than the Western pikes. And the reasons this changes were, of course, are complex than just, okay, they had to mostly fight against more nomadic hosts like the Tatars, even just all the peoples that the Ottomans also that invaded Poland in these circumstances could mobilize, right, including this stepification is something that occurred in some areas of the Ottoman domains, such as Hungary, right, after the Statal collapse of which was turned into a frontier, and the same hussars of which we will talk now that were eventually, essentially, not even Hungarian in origin, properly Serbian, and then adopted by the Hungarians and by the Poles, took on different forms as well, including the hyper heavy one, at least the one that stuck the longest in Poland, Lithuania. As we've seen, of course, also the nomads had heavier cavalry, so this is not the entire point, right? As you know, I get down pretty much to the essentials of the tactical elements, right? To me, heavy cavalry is heavy cavalry, right? It doesn't matter whether it looks like something more Eastern steppish, Islamic, or whatever, whether it's something heavier, more plate armored, and with straight swords. What they do individually is the same thing. The value that they assume on the battlefield is the same. Of course, they exist there just because there are many other types of units that essentially allow them to be there in the first place. But again, the differences in pre-industrial times, actually even later in a sense, even the thing was flattened even more between the various arms, are not that much. But it's through the details, some in fact arms and armor styles, etc., that you can appreciate what kind of role they had of environment they had to adapt to, right? Aside from the main performance for which they were designed. So I'm making things really simple now because, again, just on, the Polish army of this period, I made multiple videos of more than 2 hours long. But trying to condensate everything in a comparative way with these other peoples is fascinating, right? So the picture, of course, the political and strategic picture is crucial here. For a number of reasons. Now, in the 14th to 15th centuries, as we've seen, the Russian Palatinate, so definitely the areas of Galicia, the one of Kiev, right? So, found what seemed objectively a durable peace under the Grand Dukes of Lithuania, right? I made a video about the Russian Palatinate. We have observed how Lithuania was objectively civilized, right, by the south. The same would happen for the Muscovites, they managed later, much later on, to take control of places like on the western bank of the Dnieper River. The entire concept of modern Russia was actually fabricated at the College of Chernihiv, by the way, for the Tsars, right? It's something extremely recent, right? And this the mess that had been left by the Mongol invasions, in spite of of course, as we've seen, the collapse of the Golden Horde, and the strengthening, the converse strengthening of the Crimean Khanate, is definitely leaving a sort of civilizational vacuum that the Golden Rus, the Russian Palatinate, is definitely embodying. Right, in the late 14th century, the Lithuanian Grand Duke Vytautas became, famously enough, also King of Poland, so that for essentially 400 years, the Russian Palatinate would be part of the Polish-Lithuanian state, the Rzeczpospolita. And defending this land was a great concern, naturally, for everyone involved, because it was decentralized enough. At least places like Lviv or Kiev, etc., were easier to control. They were under a more, senatorially Slavic, administrative profile and cultural background, etc. But again, everything that laid east and south was in fact perceived as some sort of primitive, kind of wilder area that was infiltrated by lots of, say, unpleasant figures. And this is what we've seen, in fact, starting from the beginning of the Rus, right? The Khazars fundamentally had occupied that other side. Then later, after their fall, the Kumans, or even in the heyday of the Kievan Rus, where the Kumans were gradually even in part settled in these lands. These are, by the way, the same years in which the same Vytautas actually settles in fact, what will be known as the Lithuanian Tartars, Lipka Tartars, about whom I made a video that keeps getting views about them and their military role in the defense of the Rzeczpospolita. And that has, in fact, ancient roots, right, in the sense of mostly the Turks, right, our own pagans, as they call them, in the Slavic lands, as opposed to the Mongols, even though that were like the newcomers in perspective, but that by this point, the thresholds of the Renaissance were definitely blended, and hopelessly so, even with Europe, with actual Slavs, right, at that point. This is true especially for the easternmost part of the Rus, right? Their aristocracy had married into this other, into the members of the Golden Horde, etc. So, especially at this point, if you look at the Muscovite army or things like that, I made some videos about this back in the day. You realize that the differences between them and the Mongols are still minimal in terms of arms, armor, and so on, in spite of what the Byzantine canon of the icons of the Roman heroes, etc., tells us, right? Archaeology tells us. In this case, it's very, very more useful than the average. Let's put it in this way, like from my historian's bias, eloquent regarding the differences, of course, of the real phase of war that existed at the time. But also, we see definitely a Mongol war that is practically not even more. Right, the Crimean Tartars are something practically different. There's a broader kind of imperial legacy here and there, but that's basically just an Ottoman client state, as you know. That is really the giant against which these peoples really have to defend, right? Because that's the point. The Turks could infiltrate from these lands and further towards the north, invading Poland, etc. I made a video about medieval Moldavia that shows a little this game, but we'll have to come back on that prepotently at some point, because it's an incredibly important area strategically, that I loathe and reject any, let's say, talk of geopolitics, which is, essentially what the new religion of the lesser people has made as a sort of, golden word that every undereducated imbecile can use, pretending to boast any, made-up sense of any form of political or strategic competence. It is something that requires an incredibly precise and equally rare form of professional education, out of which none of that actually exists. But at least the original concept of geopolitics, as it was theorized back in the day, mostly looked during the 19th century at exactly these areas, right? Great spots of Central and Eastern Europe, between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, that was argued, the ownership of which would have, let's say, at least for a power capable of encompassing it entirely, make the difference in European dominance. And frankly, what we're seeing today is not really far from it, even though, of course, a certain situation is in part frozen, fortunately from the Western side, but another that we couldn't take care of in time is under pretty hot and labile under our very eyes. So these are very important lands to appreciate exactly in this sense, right? Because much of their history is really the reason of even in these apparently faraway centuries, much of the reason of what we see today, retrospectively. And again, I'm not a channel that really address this topic that much. I can, if you're interested. However, going on with our daily topic, you can say that, in fact, the problem started exactly in the 15th century, right? Because at this point, the Duchy of Muscovy, that had expanded considerably, they had been the protagonists, basically, first in the support received by the Mongols, and eventually the ones who basically exploited that power to shake off the yoke, but still remaining deeply informed by the Mongol autocratic ideas and so on. In fact, had claimed sovereignty on the older dream of the Kievan Rus, that is to say, in fact, as the title says, the Tsars of old Rus. So emperors, in a sense, even Roman emperors, at least by claim. This was never really done, but considered that the Russian Palatinate at some point had been, and I made some videos about various, attempts of this, and in parts even developments. Think about the Uniate Church, etc. Basically accepted even the reunification with the Roman Church under a single, at least a single order, right? That the rights of the various minorities would be somehow played with over this. So the former Russian state now evidently didn't have much of a form per se. Even the Kievan Rus, doesn't matter how powerful Kiev really was, but it was a huge thing that nobody, even just by Western European standards, could have kept together in a direct sense. So the Muscovite claims were equally bold, to say the least, and they mostly intended to show that the Muscovy was essentially to contend part of Ruthenia, in fact, of the also properly the Russian Palatinate from Poland, and mainly Lithuania in this sense, because they would remain, of course, two countries, but Poland was the one that directed, that led the dances, let's put it in this way. And Poland and Lithuania were two substantially different countries. Like for the latter, you can't properly argue that at least for the extension of the Grand Duchy, they were encompassing an Eastern European land, right? Whereas Central Europe is something that encompasses Poland, Galicia, etc., that are substantially different in level of urbanization, of population density, of communications, cultural influences, and so on. Right? Arguably, some of these lands were being molded, right, still at this point, but more or less the main lines had been drawn, right, at least in a cultural sense, and this meant that Poland had to take care, increasingly, of course, of the defense of the same Lithuania that had basically given way to the same to the weight of the Polish kingdom. That was in fact much greater, specifically, and become subservient to it. The clash with the Muscovy, especially at the beginning of this period, didn't seem, however, as great as a menace than the one of the Crimean Khanate, right? That bordered fundamentally the White Rus, the Ukrainians specifically, but that could arrive to launch raids even in Belarus, and in fact contending with Lithuania for what she was, or still, autonomous and originally independent, capable to do, the lower reaches of the Dnieper and the Dniester regions. That, of course, were crucially important as far as the coastal fortifications, right? These were parts, as we've seen in the chapter about the Italians, the Ottoman, and the Tatars, still had a dramatic trade potential, and that were being now we're shifting fundamentally in control in favor of the Crimean Tatars, in fact, and the Ottomans in practice that could back them. Right, the Crimean Tatars were not like a naval power, but the Ottomans were, and from these bases you could essentially enter, also relatively unopposed, the outer, the southern outskirts of this enormous dominion. Right, I made a video about properly the Europa Jagiellonica, which gives you an idea of the geographical extent of that. We think often like just the Austro-Hungarian Empire being something massive, and also in this kind of collage of peoples, cultures, and so on, and nothing to say really about that. But we often forget that by the 15th century, this Polish-Lithuanian power was something like enormous, to say the least, right? But mostly was like most powers, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, like the fruit of a dynastic, sum of various countries that still felt to be ruling themselves by themselves. This was even true for as we'll see now, the Polish Szlachta, the limited powers, in fact, of these monarchies that were all elective, while the West was going towards, an ever greater, more greatly concentrated and properly centralized power, to a much greater effect, right? So these regions, admittedly, were already beginning to lag behind, but they objectively towards further east, that there were way more primitive systems that, however, as we have often seen, as far as especially as the steppes is concerned, this kind of general fragmentation and incapacity to centralize can harbor, at least can shelter, can screen, like other powers such as the Ottomans, for launching much more massive operations. Right, the Ottomans naturally didn't campaign all the time against the Rzeczpospolita, but it was one of their main fronts, right? So from Sudan to Ukraine, from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, you have this giant, evidently capable of controlling whatever lays in between. That you definitely do not want to underestimate, right? These are the same centuries of the first siege of Vienna, right? 1 century later, the other option we often recall was the same Warsaw, right? It wasn't unfeasible. Of course, there were important problems about that strategically. Just the same siege of Vienna was quite complicated, but you know how close the Turks went to win, especially actually in the latter case, but even in the former one, if they had at least managed things in a bit of a different way. And just for saying that they have a series actually on the 1683 siege of Vienna, while I made, I think, only one video about the 1529 one. But anyway, we will hopefully cover this stuff in the future too. Now, what were this military cultures we discussed today about, right? So if we look at Lithuanian cavalry, that gets a bit, overshadowed by the Polish one, or even at some point by the Sipais or the Tartars themselves. Well, it definitely was the core component of the host, right? We are in times and places in which cavalry is dominant, right? Doesn't mean it can't be stopped, right? Especially with pike and shot warfare, this gradually loses power. But remember this, that the battlefields of Western Europe, of Italy, of Flanders are not the wild plains, right? They're not even Lithuania or Poland. These countries, we have observed that had always had a greater feudal and steppes bias. And cavalry was proportionally just more important. You had much greater room for maneuver. You had, it's not even about the logistics of it. People are convinced for some reason that cavalry armies are just speedier than infantry ones. This is absolutely not true, right? Unless you're a Mongol that literally rides some of the most brutally and genetically selected horse types to move at particularly large distance with an extra resilience compared to actually the already pretty high one of a normal horse, right? 150 kilometers in a day. A horse really is capable of covering for at this point even a Western army as well. The point is politics and society. Right, if you border a world where most people are at least capable of fighting on horseback on a regular basis, carrying out guerrilla tactics, harassing you, not even having definitely, as we countlessly explained, the tactical worst of it, because if you carry that out, means that you do not have what is needed strategically to shock power the enemy. Still the attritional effect can be very high, right? So you need yourself lots of these guys, and it's actually simpler than it seems, at least for the fact that, as we'll see now, some of these people live within your own boundaries, and sometimes they can't even rebel, so it's mostly a political problem rather than a military one, technically. But you also have, in fact, to convince them to fight. You have to reward them in some way. There is a great talk even of representation. At some point in history, we went close to the actual historical feasibility of a Polish-Lithuanian Ukrainian Commonwealth, right? Which was aborted for essentially a sort of short-sightedness of all the elements involved, of which actually the Muscovy would take advantage. But you gotta understand also what, in fact, that word really was, right? It was quite complicated to extend together this system. Most of the problem derived always from the aforementioned one, that is the incapacity historically of the Central and Eastern European monarchies to actually centralize differently from the Western ones, and so having a monarchy very often hostage of the nobility, in addition to the already important, say, national issues, right, even between different peoples. In any case, you have probably heard of the term Sarmatism. Some of you is particularly fascinated with this. It's something that actually happened in changing people, like with many different countries, right? It's the idea that there is a sort of quasi-anarchic, anti-statal, ethnic sort of warriorism that says, fuck the state, we're better. And then, of course, all these countries collapse, because that's literally what happened because of the Szlachta to St. Poland and more. And that's why it had become really anachronistic, while the Westerners were taking over the world basically just because of the systems that had built up. And I say this especially because I talked to an American audience that, especially as me, is a conservative audience that largely believes, as it's unfortunately normal, that decentralization has anything to do with the levels of civilization per se, right? Decentralization works if the people are virtuous. If you live in a country of lesser people, like basically the entire countries in the world are, centralization means just you're going to collapse faster. That's what it really means, right? All great civilizations were not autocratically oppressive, but they had a robust civilizational and centralization capacity, right? For obvious reasons. All the greatest military powers in the world have always had this, and there is literally no other way to make things work, right? And when things were not really like that, we're talking about tribes that, at best could skirmish with one another, and not much else. So any human value actually entails a level of, essentially, of control over a part, at least, of the people, right? Because according to tradition, if you achieve that, it's because those people are less and you're superior to them. Instead, we have turned into, of course, nationalistic and or socialistic, and as you know, the lowering of the standards entailed are always basically towards the same direction, the same paranoid status condition, let's say, in which people who say I want to be left alone are actually just people who cannot afford to be judged because they know they are failed as human beings, right? That's the actual reality in which we're living. The man rules over other men, right, by divine grace and imperial tradition, right? This is the concept that actually makes a people civilized, as opposed to the underdeveloped ones, right? And when, of course, a system goes to oppressive, it's because the system has sclerotized, right? Too many lesser people, and too many people that should, in theory, make up for that, but they're not enough, and so collapses. So it just by category, it doesn't work, right? So, and if you believe that, welcome to, the successful prank that the Marxists playing on you with materialistic deterministic structuralism, of which, of course, most of today's conservatives, as just national socialists, are completely into without even realizing that, because they couldn't afford a first-world primary education worth of this name, and they should ask something to their parents about that. And this actual theater in history is quite eloquent for the same reason. So, looking again at Lithuanian cavalry, the smallest part of it, and you can see it even from the oldest seals, aside from archaeology, in a broader sense, etc., were typically European. The Lithuanians, differently from the Poles, were not just an identical copy, say, of the Germans, right? They had some Eastern flavor attached to them. But substantially, as I was saying at the beginning, they were typically European, heavily armored knights, some of them indistinguishable from the Western ones, definitely, that included both mercenaries and local noblemen, while the larger part recruited from the middle and petty landowners were, so a sort of gentry, what in Poland was the Szlachta, formed the medium and light horse, right? There were, interestingly enough, of course, given that there were lots of Ruthenians from the Rusian Palatinate, there were Greek Orthodox knights, men-at-arms, put in this way, and as well as Roman Catholic ones. The same goes for Poland, except, again, the picture is more or less identical to any other, say, again, westernized country, related. A powerful influence on the weaponry and tactics and military role of the cavalry in the Polish-Lithuanian army was exerted in these centuries by the originally Hungarian medium cavalry, the hussars. Now, historically, we've seen there were probably kings from Romania, from France, from Scandinavia. Because again, it was always the same. We import you as a foreign ruler so that we dictate you what to do as the local ethnic nobility that basically is trying to do exactly what the monarchy tries to do, that is centralizing, but just so long as they are in charge in their own oligarchic system, right? There is hardly, again, in like, we haven't stressed this too much, but in Eastern Europe, but also in Poland, right, at this point, you find, until, very recent times, historically, the single most traumatically violent and systematic abuse and inferiorization of any trace of anyone who is basically a peasant, right? So this enormous was of just de facto serfs, right, owned by this nobleman who, of course, think to be essentially a genetically superior race that is separated from the rest of the world, believes in this still very traditional mindset, except, of course, the actual social segmentation is radically different from anything that could be, hoped for, let's say, from this guy's Sarmatian times, to which they were allegedly inspiring themselves. And this is the same reason why, I don't know, today's Russians literally do not know shit about anything, like literally history, politics, nothing. It's just, it's the paranoid confinement into that level of survival and not questioning, living essentially a paranoid existence in which lying is the only political identity that exists, right, by cultural universality, right? So this, of course, begins with the Mongols, with the Tsars. You do not become a normal country after these things, right? It just doesn't happen, right? And this is not fixed with the internet or whatever. It's the brain that literally doesn't work in the same way. Even when exposed with a certain amount of information, you need the tools to process that. If you don't have that, it's over, right? These are things that get fixed at best in a couple or a few hundred years, basically. They do not happen overnight. But the sheer radical violence that has been grafted by Mongol times is basically this picture of enormous estates ruled by an incredibly narrow amount of people who admittedly know how to make war, but from an oligarchic standpoint, not from a national or statal standpoint, because exactly their existence prevents a superior civilizational capacity to take over, right? The same reason why even today, I mean, the Russian army performed in the way it did, right? And it's the same identical thing, right? It happened all over history at a disproportionately stupid amount of cost, right? That is always paid civilization. This is not something you can indept yourself and, at some point, paying with a blank check, right? It's something you always pay in radical underdevelopment, in all the subcultural forms that you can appreciate. But it's important to understand why this system evolved the way it did, right? Or still, took some forms that to us seem right. Until you do not know those places, because admittedly most people, of course, do not. That this is being spread. This is being spread today, as we were saying before, in terms of what the average person really thinks, which is something that, frankly, nobody should care about. Also because they do not know how to defend it in the first place, because they do not know anything, as a matter of fact. There's nothing to defend. But it's something you can appreciate only, in fact, when you get to learn about the actual history, but I mean in massive form, right? Because you live in a world that doesn't matter how, displaying cultural inferiority or whatever, is still the best world, right? And still you are exposed to an incredible amount of criticism, info, whatever. It doesn't matter if it's messed up, that it's a lot of substance and the form is collapsing. It's still light years ahead, anything that existed there. So YouTube gets like this friendly place where people go watch only the videos that talk about their own countries, because, again, that's another typical indicator of cultural inferiority. And if you think you can learn history by only knowing your country, of course you do not know anything about your country, because you literally have no term of comparison. And that's exactly what you have been trained to do, like an animal, right? By your own subculture or wherever your background can be defined. But it's important to understand that, again, the short-sightedness that existed in terms of possibility of stepping further, right, to a more compact picture. Admittedly, it was complicated by other factors as well. First of all, the millenary destabilization that, as we've seen, the nomadic peoples brought properly in Eastern Europe, and there's nothing to do about that. So all the infrastructural damage, the impossibility of settling more solidly, and all the stuff, and such hopeless fragmentation, and the fact that more or less the achievements, especially of the Muscovy, were coming from the collapse of somebody else. Even the Lithuanians admittedly managed to take over the Rus largely because of the Mongol invasions. The Poles also took advantage of all the blows that the Lithuanians had taken from the Teutonic Knights, so that only together they could change, because the Lithuanians had been raiding the same Poland before that. So it's all very messed up, as it sounds. So we were talking about the Hungarians there. That's important because I was digressing from the fact that there were all these different ethnic units that you find pouring into Poland, and this was a monarchic maneuver to centralize as much as you can, right? You get people from other countries that protect you, so they do not have connections with the Szlachta, and you can hope to centralize. We've seen it being done with the nomadic peoples all the time. The Lipka Tatars, the Cumans in Hungary, in other places, it's always the same old story, right? You have, again, French troops. You have even literally a Janissary Guard modeled, right? They weren't actual Turks, but they acted as one, so it is a bit like the bizarre taste and background of Renaissance rulers by a degree, but there was always a very specific political reason. The Hungarian cavalry of the Hussars had been born in Serbia, right? And the term seems originally, meaning properly bandit, right? So this type of cavalry was spread first in Hungary, then in Poland as a type of cavalry, not just like the actual people from either Serbia or Hungary. And as you know, the Hussar would become essentially a let's call it a cavalry specialty. I made a video appropriately about the origins of these infantries, especially as far as 18th century warfare is concerned, with the Uhlans, the Hussars, the Dragoons, etc. But they all had this steppes origin in a way, or at least one that was heavily influenced by it. The Hussars represent, in a sense, that world, that century world of places like Hungary or Serbia, etc., that had been, however, overrun by the Ottomans, had turned in part in a frontier again. So essentially the passage, also together with the Ottoman army of forces that were quite exotic, such as the Tartars that came from that far away always to loot in the vanguard of the Ottoman armies, laying waste everything they found. What is fascinating about the Hussars is that both in Hungary and in Poland, these cavalries become heavy, however, right? Because they essentially equate to some sort of soldiery. At some points, like the Stratiots, the Albanians in service of Naples or Venice, or etc. But again, in Hungary and in Poland, they actually become heavy, so actually the same nobility folk in that way. In Hungary, however, because of the collapse of the kingdom at the hands of the Ottomans, the Hussars, the nobility is largely weakened, and so this Hussar comes back to be light, right? And so that's mostly the model over which the 18th century type comes from. Right. While in Poland, as we were saying before, the Hussar actually indicates that heavier knight, this very heavy knight, that really was the protagonist of some of the greatest military success of the era, right? And that the nobility themselves fought in the style, right? So imagine the Polish-Lithuanian army made up by a core of royal, a small core of royal units, whatever they could leverage, and in part still subcontract to the nobles, however, through some sort of public funds, and especially subcontracting to the nobles for the sake of command and some kind of royal, let's say, post, let's put it in this way. And all the private forces of the oligarchs that had to be levied technically as vassals of the king, but that were paid de facto, and that were mini armies, let's say, not even mini actually, but armies on their own, right? Bishops had armies with artillery parks, whatever, and representing that sense of ultra privatistic, anti-statalistic mentality that prevented, however, this system to coalesce into some more compact one in the first place, and all, of course, on the shoulders of the peasantry. That was, I mean, it's not that I care, as you understand, about this relation. What I care about is to make you understand how many were the peasants and how demilitarized they. Say in part they were, but admittedly there were some uprisings in different times in all these countries, but more dictated by the extreme misery rather than a substantial strength, right? Even the original Schlachta actually was a sort of gentry that also gradually became poor. This had happened also in Hungary. We've seen it with their gentry equivalent, etc. So when we talk about Schlachta, mostly we talk about the ultra elite at some point, right? So this increases over time in social segmentation. Now we don't have the time to simply document it in detail throughout the centuries. In any case, when you look at the Polish-Lithuanian Hussars, you notice a lack of defensive armor in this earlier phase, right? So they would become also gradually the heavier ones of the later times. Some of them were actually a coat of mail or a cuirass beneath the kaftan, so don't get me wrong. There were, under the denomination Hussars, different types of troops, the elite ones and the lighter ones. But overall, right, in the early phase, in late medieval, in the Renaissance times, Still, the original Hungarian Serbian model was the lighter type, right? Distinctive was for the unarmored ones as single piece of protection the small shield that was famously shaped as a wing, right? It was very effective for a mounted soldier. It had many. It was convenient, like it had a concave concave shape. It offered some sort of visual through a hole at the top. And what is interesting about the design is that it probably evolved from some properly anti-archer, anti-arrow shields specifically, not just properly a melee one. These designs that were originally squared in shape are typical of the entire crescent that goes from the Balkans to Eastern Europe and were designed, including the early pavises, that were not just the Italian type that would become the most famous, the largest, etc., but that were in fact emerging in Lithuania in the 13th century, the early 13th century, more or less at the same time. I will not digress on the pavis because that's not here the problem, but the etymology suggests that the actual role of this shield was the increased level of thickness of some sort, or at least probably of composition to make it less penetrable, especially by arrows, right, by piercing more than else. And this had developed, especially as a horse shield, at this time, probably because of the aforementioned reason among these peoples, differently, for example, from the Italians that used it extensively on foot, but also on horseback, because most of their armies were mounted. Like, if you look at the Lithuanian forces of the 13th century, well, they were not mostly mounted in a numerical sense. Most of them were on foot. But the infantries were weaker in Eastern Europe. Right, so the ones who had to be hyper-loaded were normally the knights, and in this, as it was normal in general, as you understand, but that in this part had preferred also to develop some distinctive shield designs, probably because of missile protection from missile reasons. Let's put it in this way. This is a theory I developed over the years because I came across the Lithuanian shields, the Lithuanian pavises specifically. I looked a bit into Lithuanian warfare, also the pre-Mongol one, let's say, because naturally the Lithuanians from the 13th century get a lot of Mongol influence as well. The Mongols come to knock at the Lithuanian doors, and they still claim some overlordship over the same Ruthenia that the Lithuanians control. So it is particularly important to appreciate what also the type of enemies, of course, against which these weapons were developed. The shield had, as we were saying, a cut in the upper right corner, which could be used both for lodging the shaft of the spear, and so maintaining some sort. I consider that most of these guys were unarmored, right? So the idea is that they still were sort of hit and run forces capable of both melee, but capable of shock charge, but also of getting the hell out of there, bailing out, disengaging quickly enough. But also for visual, as you can imagine, protecting even the face, the head, with that, you could imagine also a bit of a more crouched position. In fact, if you look at late medieval Hungarian knights, you see still that some had the high stirrup staying more crouched, like the nomads, right? It was a bit of a Magyar legacy in insight, but it was surely connected with, in fact, the necessity of fighting, as it happened for the Hungarians, against a consistent amount of steppes, enemies, including the Mongols themselves at a point. So that is something that probably survives in this very tradition, and it would be like, of course, we don't have a camera to see how they actually rode, but lots of details hint at this incredibly fine, considering that this was properly soldiered, at least especially during the Renaissance, it came to be, qualified professionally as such, and paid, and maintained as, in fact, military professionals. To highlight this incredibly balanced, in fact, relation between the need of shock and the need of withdrawing, with an interesting compromise in a world where still an arrow could take you out, right? Even more frequently than an actual arquebus shot, right? Which would have been present in less quantity compared to the arrows, but was much more devastating for sure. But if you look at the odds, especially on an Eastern European frontier, you want to be careful against arrows. More, say, this debatable, right? You have to calculate the joules and everything, but we don't have mostly the ratio of how many shots were fired of both weapons, right? That's a matter of numbers, and you can't reconstruct it. Sorry, engineering trying to explain how warfare worked. That's not how it really works. In fact, in any case, the other impressive element in the Hussar panoply was the saddle-sabre, later supplemented with the konchar, that is a very long rapier used to finish off a dismounted enemy. The Hussars can be thought of as knights without armor and helmets, in a way. So again, the lighter version of the average men-at-arm in Central Eastern Europe. It's a bit maybe a forced comparison, but the environment makes you see it better, as we explained. And of course, all these weapons, also these blades, were perfectly suited to a mounted combat, or this finishing off once, especially the guy. You can imagine the exhausting chases, right, and all done with, even mounted shots, or archers trying to kill each other in this fashion, and even just and also in melee. So all this requires, as you understand, an incredible training, an incredible fitness, a lifestyle that you can find, in fact, only in these parts of Europe, because as wild and primitive as they are, they're also basically the least gentrified, right? It's not that you can argue that, like, if you look at what the Westerners did too, like all around the world, conquistadors, but even just the nobility, like they were real pros. But this role specifically was, again, designed for a very particular environment, that is the steppes, very often. That is not to be found elsewhere, this pointedness. Now, in the 15th and early 16th centuries, the bulk of soldiers using firearms in the Rzeczpospolita were mercenaries from Central and Western Europe, prevalently Germans, literal pike and shot troops. Right, Germany was very fragmented. At a point, also during the 15th century, was actually the single most technologically developed country in Europe, together with Italy. Meaningful enough, they had good. Being the 16th century witnessed a great crisis, as you know, with the peasant wars, the Reformation. Germany really suffered the most, as you know, during the 30 Years' War, but also these ones were pretty heavy times. Also a great social crisis. So it was full of Germans that sold their services abroad. They brought with them their Western organization. Again, in Poland, there were militias, leaving aside properly the ones of the German cities that belonged to Poland, such as Danzig, for example, that had a very developed militia. We talked about it in the early modern Polish army organization. But the Slavic population was not so urbanized, so organized also politically, nor they accessed just immediately the best equipment or whatever. So, as we've seen, most people lived under the oligarchs. They were, for this reason, disarmed, and it was mostly these people, either the king or the nobleman, to hire these mercenaries. They were quite effective, telling the truth. And again, you look at Reiter, the Polish tactics were pretty much the same. I began the video with that splendid Gothic armor of a Polish nobleman. That tells you really everything, right? So this early time, especially the 16th century, is overall still very much like Poland trying to just catch up with the on the same level of the Western updates, right? Technically speaking, and also in types of troops and whatever. With the mid-16th century, however, you see that also the Poles and the Lithuanians decide to increase the number of essentially national infantry. So with armed with fused muskets, right? But also, and this is a bit typical characteristics of these countries, together also with the Muscovy and so on, the combination of weapons like handguns, in fact, with other kind of cold steel stuff, sabers, berdishes, plus mail protection, and also a helmet. Admittedly, the latter two were not so strange. At least there were cuirasses, even among some heavy infantry. Think about the Spanish Rodilleros, or also the Janissaries pass as unarmored, but actually they weren't, at least some of them. But tendentially, pike and shot warfare heads towards a gradual loss of armor. In this century, it's still present there. It's not disappeared. It's far from. But what the characteristic that you can appreciate of this more Eastern infantry is that they are equally designed for coping with situations where they technically have, first of all, less firepower than in the West. They have also generally less collective training, but they're a bit, again, hardcore, kind of primitive, to the point that they can't take on the enemy even with berdishes, with weapons that are quite still medieval, right? And that, however, quite effective as well. That, again, it's anachronism of success. The hussars last for a pretty long time. The guards equipped with double-handed axes are something you find even there throughout the entire 17th century as a troop, not just as NCOs as they would be later with halberds or whatever. So you get the impression that these guys were ad hoc troops, not necessarily rushed. They were professionals, also very disciplined, drilled, collectively trained ones. But that overall, the Rzeczpospolita provides in smaller numbers than in the West, comparatively, right? Because they have, for example, more cavalry than in the West. So everything is balanced in a different fashion. The need naturally to again keep essentially updated with the West in a broader sense will always remain. Of course, especially the royal troops of the Commonwealth will be historically very very modern, and somehow, at least, again, it's always a matter of numbers, but it's never about the availability of the techniques or the technologies. That's the least important thing of all. Of course, they had it, right? The problem is how much field of application do you have? In other words, how many funds do you have, right, to field ever larger armies, courageously based on foot, right? Troops that can deliver ever greater firepower and stopping power, etc. When you have just naturally so many troops that you can levy in from the eastern frontiers, right? From peoples that, again, may be backwards, but they're still strong to a degree, and also essentially putting them together in this kind of pretty multicultural armies, if you want. This is a bit the giant that the Polish-Lithuanian army really represents. Again, this introduction is very unsatisfactory, in at least as far as we're habituated to on Schwerpunkt, so I will not go on. You can find all the rest again in the links I provide you below. However, and there is another part here is very important, constituted by the Zaporizhian Cossacks. The Zaporizhian-XVI, right, this semi-autonomous polity and essentially proto-state of Cossacks, right, that was established in the mid-16th century on the Khortytsa island on the Dnipro river. This was essentially a stronghold. The Sich also seemingly has to do with, etymologically, with the fortification which they had established. And much of their history is famous in a romantic, piratic kind of way, right? These were some sort of, autonomous peoples that are rebellious to authority, like greatly imbued with a sense of freedom, right? That really were the tip of the balance in many circumstances between Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy, the Crimean Khanate. They had emerged essentially as a Ukrainian militia designed to protect essentially from the Tatar raids from Crimea that were essentially keeping alive the traditional looting of actual people to sell in slavery. As we've seen in other videos, the Crimean Khanate had really a lot of sort of things going on in terms of armor production, initially at least, quite a central position. They had, in a sense, even, taken control some parts of the hinterland that had formerly belonged to the Golden Horde. So they were a bit like a pain in the behind. They aligned mostly with the Ottomans, and they were still the nomads that, as we said, were actually having the worst of the situation on the longer run. These free bands of Cossacks were historically emerging. I mean, the term comes probably from Kazakh, right? And if you look at the early names, there are studies on this. They were originally Tartars, right? So they were not, aside from possible cooptations, adoptions through raids, slavery, and so on. I mean, think about the Ottoman Janissaries. Surely there were lots of ethnic Europeans among them since the beginning. But the Cossacks that eventually we get to know are actual Eastern Europeans, right? They're Russians that by birth that usually also joined the Sich as outlaws from the rural community. So there is a lot of that sense of, think about this, the Igor song, or that sense of almost berserker, Ulfadnar kind of mentality. Consider the Kumans, as other people still believed in that stuff. So that word is much closer than we think, and it's definitely just not, as you know, a northern thing. It's present among all peoples in all continents. So quite a picturesque group, which turned into river and sea robbers, right? So harassing the mostly the Tartars. They were excellent horsemen for that matter, too. As at least as much as they pushed further into the steppes, they acquired that lifestyle. sometimes probably a nomadic lifestyle themselves, but the majority was based on this islands, the ones of the Dnipro. What is fascinating is that the Zaporizhian and Cossacks were joined by exiles, outcasts, people who had to flee their homes from all over Europe. You could find them like really, it was a pretty multinational context where, this sense, again, rebellious spirit against the main powers of the time, at least this purity, this sort of closer contact with can say with nature, but at least with those things that made you, feel more hype, right, in terms of robbing, massacring, all this stuff. It was a way, right? Was a way to still be found in this corner of Europe, which deserves actually better consideration, say on the longer term, because as you know, much of what the Cossacks did was also connected with the broader and higher politics at the time of the Ukrainians, the Ruthenians, the Lithuanians, the Poles, and again I made a series about modern Ukraine, which makes you see the thing in bit better terms, but they were always up for a fight. The Cossack host, especially in the early period, was very well organized, right? They weren't just a bunch of martyrs. They were quite advanced in tactics, in weaponry. They were masters of guerrilla, but also of larger operations, right? Amphibious ones. They had a wide organization, but they were a real, system that kept together by also the pressure that came from the external, from the various neighbors. You could think stereotypically of a Cossack commander wearing a mailcoat and brassard, having some of actually the heaviest equipment available for the time. They wouldn't have like in a great abundance for every leader, but they were still there. They had still kind of a steps phase, right? As far as bow, quiver, like was a normal element of their panoply. These bows had essentially the longest range available at the time. Also, they, however, appreciated gunpowder, firearms. They didn't have any specific trouble to adopt them. If anything, maybe just the cost that, again, and the type of warfare that mostly privileged more archaic ways of such in fact, the same archery, but that's an overstatement regarding to it, at least. They constituted a very mobile, agile, harassing, insidious infantry that resembles a bit also the same Janissary ones, if you think about that, in this combination of firepower, both with firearms and arrow fire, and some kind of assault capacities, excellent logistics, especially as far as their lands could allow them to move fast across the river. I mean, living on but like the same Russian legacy that had been the one of the time of the Varangians, the Nords. This maybe seem jarring comparisons, but they're actually not, because in part they are literally the same people, it's the same descendants of those people. And this type of warfare naturally had always been existing there. Like any people who had inhabited the wild fields had practiced more or less the same type of warfare historically. We've seen it practically throughout all the series about steppe warfare. As a melee weapon, the saber was the most characteristic Cossack weapon. The leaders also were loaded with maces, picks, and axes that symbolized their freedom, right? In the sense that some of these weapons were also symbolic, right? At least the mace, the scepter, the baton of war, in a way that resembles still that Turkic-Mongolian influence of the sense of the Oceanic rulers, and the sense of unmitigated bravery of being also as lighter troops sometimes able to prove themselves, to test themselves by attacking heavily armored opponents from other armies, but also being these efficient killing machines as far as the lighter enemies that would mostly cope with are concerned, right? I think one of the main aspects of this people, as we'll see also later in other videos, is the capacity to adapt to this incredibly threatening neighbors, right? They were basically in their politics, especially in the Lithuanian and Polish one, but I mean, you do not survive quite easily between the Muscovites, the Ottomans, and the Polish Lithuanians and the Crimean Tatars. Just saying, especially in that world, in those circumstances, admittedly in this early time, it was easier in the sense that those powers were not, also so powerful as it would get at some other point, or at least there were different timings, chronologies about this. But the length, right, and a bit the same, even after the Russian conquest, I mean, still the presence of this anarchoid spirit that was based on a sort of, still armed peasantry of some sort. This was the main difference. The social issue, as far as the social segmentation, they knew how their peoples lived under the nobility, the peasantry under them. Of course, same Cossack leaders, the hetmans, etc. They had really a lot of land and prisoners, also prisoners of war to trade, etc. But peasants under their control. But overall, the bulk, at least of their forces, was that savagely connected to the sense that nobody could strip even them as freemen, right, of their free. Everything was a bit more shaded than I make it sound, and definitely it was no paradise or heaven for anyone involved. But from a military point of view, that stands out because their military organization was as effective, especially as that kind of social profile was maintained for a time. Speaking of the virtue at the beginning, yes, you can't be an anarchoid system, a sort of proto-state or whatever, without too many centralistic means, if you have a reason to stick together anyway and to be able to jointly, if you are aware of what kind of threats come from the outside, to the point of picking up arms and going there, doing the thing yourself. That may not be enough for everything, because you still do not have an updated professional army corps, right, like other powers are forming. So that it's something similar, at least considering what the standards were also for the other countries at this point. Then on the longer run, of course, things would go another way. But again, we will observe all these peoples. We've already seen again in the video about the Polish-Lithuanian army of this time. We've seen how important the Cossacks themselves really were. They could rebel, but because they were in the Far East, and it was very difficult to go there in the wild plains to dislodge them on those terrible grounds, and committing an incredible amount of forces at very long distance from your power bases, but the sense is that you could mobilize lots of them quickly, right? It would be triggered like a horde, a moving one, and being quite effective and efficient if they wanted to be so, right? Naturally, they wanted something in exchange. They wanted also to normalize their situation. That was much more complicated, and it's one of the the reasons why the actual Commonwealth in the end wouldn't make it in perspective. But again, that's pretty much it for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.